Hi, folks, and welcome back. This week we are changing gears once again, switching gears once again. We're going to engage in a discussion over the next 3 weeks about some of the ethical challenges raised by anthropogenic climate change. And we're going to start that discussion this week by thinking about whether we have an obligation individually to address climate change, to do what we individually can in order to avert some of the worst consequences of climate change, or whether it's better understood as a kind of obligation of collective action, whether it is an obligation that we as a community have to address climate change that calls on each of us individually to engage in political acts to force the governments that the governments that represent us and the corporations with which we engage to address the problem of climate change. So that's the topic for the week. To get started, though, I want to spend some time thinking about or reviewing some of the science behind climate change, some science with which we should all be pretty familiar at this point, and so I'm not going to belabor the point, but I do want to take just a moment to make sure we're all on the same page. Over the past 1 million years or so, the CO2 concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere have ranged between 172 and 300 parts per million. This has been a relatively stable period in the Earth's climate history. It first broke 300 parts per million around the time that the Titanic sank, that is in 1911. About 109 years ago. And since that time, really since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the CO2 concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere have been steadily increasing. In March 2020, CO2 levels reached 415.11 parts per million. Well over the highest historical level ever registered, which is around 300 parts per million. 3 parts per million higher than it was just a year ago in March. So it's steadily increasing and doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon. Great. What does this mean? Well, CO2 is a greenhouse gas. Greenhouse gases trap energy near the Earth's surface. They act as a sort of envelope or blanket over the Earth, and as the energy from the sun reflects off the Earth's surface, it's trapped near the surface as heat by these greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane chief among them. And we can see that CO2 levels historically have had a significant impact on the Earth's temperature. Here we're looking at a graph of the Earth's temperature and CO2 concentrations over the past 800,000 years. And we see a very strong correlation between CO2 concentrations and temperature. So CO2 causes increases in the average temperature of the planet. And it's projected to continue to cause increases in the average temperature of the planet. Significant increases by 2100, but really significant increases in the next few decades, in all of our lifetimes, are likely to result from the increased concentrations of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And these significant temperature increases are likely to be highly disruptive. Disruptive in what sorts of ways? Well, they're going to change the climate that we live in. That is, they're going to cause it to be less stable than it has been over the entirety of human civilization. Storms are going to become less predictable and more powerful. Droughts are going to become more prevalent in some regions. Some regions will become wetter. The DC region is likely to become wetter, for example. Some regions will suffer the consequences of rising sea levels. So parts of our coastal cities will become uninhabitable over the next few decades. The areas in which we've grown crops historically, the breadbaskets of Europe, of North America, of Asia, will no longer be able to sustain the same crops that we have historically grown in these regions. This could lead to food insecurity. It could lead to water insecurity. It's likely to lead to significant political unrest. Just to put things in perspective, XKCD did a really nice cartoon a few years ago giving a timeline of the Earth's temperature, average temperatures, over the Earth's history, with a particular focus on the history of human civilization. And what this timeline draws out so nicely is the fact that all of human civilization, from the time that we settled in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers until the present day, the Earth's temperature has fluctuated within about a 2-degree window, a 2 degrees Celsius window of the average temperature from about 1960 to about 1990. It hasn't gone much outside of that 2-degree window over the entire history of humanity. But we are quickly approaching a time when we will leave that comfort zone behind. We will leave that 2-degree window behind. And it's unclear what will happen to human civilization as we enter into this uncharted territory. We've never been here before. We've never existed on a planet that was so rapidly changing. There will be no new normal for us. There will be a period of constant change and constant need to adapt. And it's not clear whether we or other species on our planet will be able to adapt so quickly to a changing environment. It's quite likely that significant political unrest will result. It's quite likely that significant migration of human populations will result, and all of the tensions that those migrations bring will be felt globally, will be felt by countries all over the planet. None of us is likely to escape entirely the effects of climate change. So what are some of those effects? Well, in 2018, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a UN body, issued a report looking at the different effects, or the differential effects of 2 degrees Celsius of warming over pre-industrial levels compared to 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming over pre-industrial levels. 2 degrees Celsius is the target that the Paris Agreement set. 2 degrees Celsius is what many have talked about for years as the sort of benchmark that we need not to cross. But the IPCC said in this report that 1.5 degrees Celsius should be our target. 2 degrees Celsius has significantly greater effects on global climate than 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming would have. So just some examples. At 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, we would see an ice-free Arctic summer once per century. At 2 degrees Celsius, we would see an ice-free Arctic summer once per decade. The world population affected by extreme heat waves at 1.5 degrees Celsius would be about 14%. At 2 degrees, about 37%. We're talking heat waves that are lethal, heat waves that will kill human beings. At 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's likely we'll see about 350 million people suffering from urban water scarcity. Cities will run out of water. Cities like Johannesburg, South Africa, are already experiencing this. Cities like Mumbai are already experiencing this, where their reservoirs are running dry as a result of extended droughts. At 2 degrees Celsius warming, 411 million people will be suffering from urban water scarcity. There will be significantly more plant and animal loss globally at 2 degrees Celsius warming. 18% of all insects on the planet, 16% of all plants, and 8% of all vertebrates will be lost. At 1.5 degrees warming, 80% of the world's coral reefs are wiped out. At 2 degrees warming, nearly all of the coral reefs are gone. Nearly all of the coral reefs are gone. And sea level rise and the effect that it has on human populations will be much greater at 2 degrees Celsius of warming. At 1.5 degrees, 31 to 69 million people are likely to be exposed to flooding. At 2 degrees Celsius, we're likely to see an additional 10 centimeters of sea level rise by 2100, and 32 to 80 million people globally will be exposed to flooding. So these are just some of the likely effects. Last year, David Wallace Wells wrote a piece in the Intelligencer, the New York Magazine Intelligencer, and published later a book on this same topic, exploring some of the worst case scenarios of climate change, and they are terrifying. We're talking famine, economic collapse, heat that is literally unlivable in some regions, some regions becoming so hot that they become uninhabitable, desertification of some regions as a result of sustained drought, and some regions reverting to a kind of rainforest state as a result of increased precipitation, because the air will be holding more water as a result of higher global temperatures. Climate change is likely to wreak significant havoc on human populations in our lifetime. Not just in our children's lifetime, my children's lifetime, your children's lifetime, or our grandchildren's lifetime. In our lifetime, we're likely to see many of these effects. Much of the philosophical work, ethical work on climate change has explored this question of what our obligation is to future generations. How do we have obligations to human beings who don't yet exist, and what obligations do we have to human beings who don't yet exist? But this is a question that I think we can set aside at this point, because the time has come where the human beings who will suffer the effects of climate change do already exist. They are already here. We are them. We will suffer these results. We will suffer these effects. So we no longer need to think about the obligation we have to future generations. We need to think about the obligations we have to people who are now alive, the obligations we have to our own families, to our own children, to citizens of the countries in which we live, to citizens of the globe. We need to think about the obligations we have to those who are most likely to be affected by climate change. So this still leaves us with two sets of reasons that we might concern ourselves with. First, we might concern ourselves with our well-being and that of our children, out of a kind of selfish concern, a self-interested concern for our own well-being and the well-being of our families. We certainly have an obligation to protect ourselves and our families. We certainly have a moral obligation to leave an earth that is inhabitable by our children by our grandchildren. We certainly have an obligation to protect the planet for our own futures, our own use. So we have these self-interested reasons, but we also have other directed reasons. We have reasons directed at those others whom are most likely to be affected by climate change. We have to concern ourselves with the well-being of already existing and future others. In particular, we have to concern ourselves with the well-being of impoverished individuals, of people who have suffered historical oppression, of people who live in developing countries in the global south, where the effects of climate change are likely to be most acute. Those people who are most likely to, or least likely to have the resources to escape these effects, and most likely to suffer daily as a result of these impacts. We certainly have a moral obligation to concern ourselves with their well-being. We have an obligation of solidarity to this global population. We're in this together. We have an obligation to do well by them. The question we're asking today and this week is, what is the content of that obligation? How do we best enact that obligation? How do we best fulfill that obligation that we have to ourselves, to our families, and to those who are most likely to be impacted by climate change? The task before us is immense. The task before us, according to the IPCC, is to reach peak CO2 emissions by 2030. We have 10 years now to get our emissions under control, to get our act together, and to reach peak CO2 emissions. Beyond 2030, and it's going to be impossible for us to keep global warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius. In order to do that, they say, we need to reach net zero by about 2040. So we have about 20 years to get to net zero CO2 emissions. That's a significant decline. How do we do that? Where should we focus? Well, there are a number of things we might focus on, but this chart brings out something that is really important to recognize, that the richer a country is, the greater its consumption is likely to be, and the greater its consumption, the greater its impact in terms of CO2 emissions. So lifestyle emissions from global north countries, from the USA, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, Italy, Russia, France, Japan, South Korea, Mexico even, are substantially higher than the per capita emissions of countries like, or of global south countries, substantially greater. And yet within these global north countries, the emissions, the per capita emissions of the top 10% far outpace the per capita emissions of the bottom 50 or bottom 40%, even the average per capita emissions in these countries. So it's the top 10% of consumers in the most advanced economies in the world who are responsible for the lion's share of climate change emissions from lifestyle consumption choices. This is because the top 10% usually travel more, usually own larger homes, usually fly more, and engage in practices that account for much greater emissions. So this suggests one sort of response to climate change. We need to convince everyone, but in particular those who have the greatest per capita consumption to change their individual behaviors. They need to make better personal choices to reduce their contribution, and we need to make better personal choices to reduce our contribution to climate change. We ought to engage in what's sometimes called sustainable consumerism or ethical consumerism. We ought to buy organic produce. We ought to buy sustainably made clothes. We ought to buy Energy Star appliances and better insulate our homes. We ought to buy electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles. We ought to guide our consumeristic choices in such a way that we have the least impact that we can in terms of carbon emissions. And so there are a lot of things we can do. We can upgrade our light bulbs in our homes. This has low impact, less than 0.2 tons of CO2 per year. Having a slightly greater impact, we can hang dry our clothes rather than using the dryer. We can recycle. We can compost. We can wash clothes in cold water rather than hot water. We can replace our car with a hybrid. This has an impact of about 0.2 to 0.8 tons of CO2 reduction per year. A little bit more of an impact can be had by those of us who switch to a plant-based diet, or who switch to an electric car, or switch from an electric car to a car-free lifestyle using public transportation and bicycles, who purchase green energy for our homes, who avoid flying, who live a car-free lifestyle entirely, and something we'll talk about next week, by choosing to have fewer children. All of these are individual choices that we can make in order to have in order to create a smaller carbon footprint for ourselves. But this focus on individual choices feels empowering. It feels like each of us can make a significant difference on the problem of climate change. It feels like each of us can do our part. And it fits with the kind of consumerism that is rampant in the global north, that is rampant in particular Western developed economies. We feel as though we make our values known. We enact our values in the world through our choices vis-a-vis consumption, through the way that we spend our money, through the way that we act as purchasers in the economy. It also seems to fit with the kind of individualism that is deeply ingrained in American culture, but in Western culture more generally. This kind of individualism that says that individual autonomy, my ability to make choices for myself, is central. This approach to climate change says that my autonomous choices are what can have the greatest impact. So we find ethical consumerism attractive. That's the word I want. Attractive for these sorts of reasons. But individual actions don't always pay off. We're often misinformed or lack good information about the sorts of choices we're making. We think that the impact we're having is greater than the impact actually is. A survey in Germany showed, for example, that people who engage in ethical consumerism, who practice ethical consumerism, think that their carbon emissions are about 30% less than the average German citizen, when in fact they are about average and sometimes a little bit worse than average. So the payoff isn't always there. We also face the problem of moral license. That is, when you think that you are doing something good for the environment, you might allow yourself to also engage in some behaviors that are not so good for the environment. I buy green energy for my home, so I can take that vacation in France and take that transatlantic flight. They offset. But in fact, they may not. In fact, it may be even worse. So these individual actions don't always pay off in the way we think they do. Moreover, we don't choose in a vacuum. We're not in control of our own choices in the way that we think we are. We choose from a limited menu of options that are presented to us by the companies that shape our individual interests and desires. We are creatures that are affected by marketing, affected by social pressures that act on our individual psychology by shaping the choice architecture, by shaping the environment in which we make choices. So since we're not choosing in a vacuum, we're not actually as in control of our individual choices as we think we are. They're often shaped by the corporations who benefit from us choosing in one way and not another. They're often shaped by large multinational corporations, by large energy corporations and conglomerates that can benefit from us making some choices rather than other choices. Moreover, the burdens are inequitably distributed. Some people have the luxury, the privilege of engaging in ethical consumerism, but not everyone does. Some people can't afford to be ethical consumers, can't afford to shop at Whole Foods, can't afford an electric vehicle, can't afford to live in walkable communities, because walkable communities are becoming more and more expensive as more and more people want to live in them. Many people get forced out of them and into suburban life where a car is a necessity, for example. And when we judge those people to be less moral because they don't engage in ethical consumerism, that seems like a dangerous judgment to make. It's not a choice for them. We shouldn't judge them on this basis. So the burdens of ethical consumerism are inequitably distributed. Moreover, individual actions are just a drop in the bucket. 100 companies account for 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Major energy companies and chemical companies account for the vast majority of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, we need some care here. It is, of course, the case that these companies are selling to us, or are part of production chains that are providing products that we consumers use. These companies would not exist without consumers to purchase their products, and so we are responsible in part for the emissions of these companies. But it is the choices that these companies make, the investments that these companies make, that determine in part what products are available to us, and that determine in part what products they will market to us, and so determine in part what our desires are, determine what our preferences are. And so there's a loop here that we need to pay attention to, a loop that we often lose sight of. We are purchasing from these companies, but they are shaping our purchasing behavior. They're shaping our consumeristic behavior. And so these companies seem to bear the lion's share of the responsibility for these greenhouse gas emissions. But they themselves, these corporations themselves, are responding to certain kinds of pressures. They are responding to certain kinds of incentives and are affected by the choice architecture in which they are making decisions. And so it is the system as a whole that bears responsibility here, the system that enacts these incentives that major corporations are responsive to. So the question then becomes, how do we collectively change those incentive structures? How do we collectively change the incentives that are acting upon corporations who are then shaping our preferences in order to increase their profits, which are responsive to the incentives placed on them by a system of capitalist consumption? How do we do this? How do we change those incentive structures? How do we change the behavior of these corporations? How do we change the behavior of individuals as the result of changing the behaviors of these corporations? The answer is a kind of collective action. So perhaps rather than thinking of our individual obligations to better the climate, to address the problem of climate change in terms of obligations to be more ethical consumers, obligations to reduce our individual carbon footprint, we ought to think of the obligation as an obligation to engage in collective action to change these global incentive structures. What kind of collective action? Political action. We need to go out and vote. We need to change who holds the power. We need to work in a political way to gain power, to shape the agenda, to shape the incentive structures within which corporations are acting. We need to change the policy structures within which they're acting. We need to change the regulations under which their activities are governed. We do this through political means. We do this through political organizing. We do this through protest. We do this through boycott. We do this through direct action. We come together to collectively shape the world we want to inhabit. We come together to intentionally shape the world we want to inhabit. Perhaps the obligation we have is an obligation to engage in such collective and political action. If we want a better world, we need to make it, not by changing our individual choices, our individual consumption behavior, but by changing the environment within which we make those choices and within which corporations make those choices. With that, I'm going to step off my high horse here. Hopefully we can have some interesting discussion about these topics tomorrow in class. And I look forward to hearing your thoughts on how we should think about the obligation to address climate change.